ministry to the Gentiles and the spread of the gospel and the spread of the church around the world. That's what we see there. We see that Paul replaces Peter as a central figure because in the first 12 chapters, Peter is the main one that's preaching, and then here we see Paul preaching the gospel. We also see 3 missionary journeys that Paul goes through, and it's within these 3 journeys that we see new believers coming to the church, we see the church being sustained, and we see Paul enduring a great amount of persecution as a result of preaching the gospel. So the main idea behind this piece was I wanted to do a piece that was going to convey suffering and that was going to speak about the persecution that Paul went through. But before I get into that, I want to speak about what was his message? Why did he get persecuted? And as Victor stated earlier, his message was that salvation now comes by grace, not by works. And our sanctification is through faith, and it's not through the law of Moses. And as a result of preaching this message, what that means is that we have a relationship with God. We're able to go to heaven simply by grace. Not by anything that we can do, not by any act, not by any work. We can't earn it. We can't do anything for it. It is a free gift. So in essence, that's the message that Paul is preaching. And the Gentiles are persuaded and they come to the Lord and they're delighted by this message that they don't have to earn God's love, that they don't have to earn their way into heaven. But the Jews don't like this at all. They like living under the law of Moses. They like having their daily regimen and what they have to do. They like wanting to, work for their salvation. And as a result of that, they persecute Paul. And I know that when I say persecute, it might be a little hard for you to embrace because it's not something that we deal with here in America. But this man shed his blood over and over and over again because of this message. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, we see a good summary of all that he endured, and I'd like to read that verse. Victor did read it, but I'm going to read it again if you don't mind. Okay. It's kind of long, so bear with me, but I want you to listen. I want you to think about, I want you to put yourself in this place and think about how this would feel. I want you to really get the essence of what this man suffered, okay? It says, "Are they servants of Christ? I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers." A lot of danger there in his life. "I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst. I have gone without food and have been cold and naked." And what's interesting about this, when Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, it was during his 3rd missionary journey. And you'll see that in Acts chapters 18 through 21. What's interesting about that is when he wrote it, he still wasn't done suffering. He was still going to continue to experience suffering. So this is just like a light summary. This man continues to suffer for the sake of Christ. But in this passage, I was really intrigued by the 40 lashes minus 1. And I was like, I don't understand. Why didn't he just say he got whipped 39 times? So through research, I found that according to Jewish law, that if a guilty man deserves to be beaten, that he shall receive the number of lashes worthy of his crime, but that those lashes should not exceed 40. So that was according to their law. And some people believe that if you got whipped more than 40 times, that it could actually kill you. So when he says 40 minus 1, he's trying to bring them back to what the law states. And then he also is emphasizing that basically he's nearly getting beaten to death for the sake of the gospel. Not just once, not just twice, but 5 times he received 40 lashes minus 1. And with that, that's why I painted these hands here that are in chains. When a man was whipped or flogged, that's also what that means. Their hands were placed in chains, and it was then placed above their heads. And the top of the chain was then nailed to a post, and then they were whipped. So this angle, someone would be whipping from the back. Does that make sense? Are you guys getting the visual there? And the purpose for this was that, I don't know about you, but if I even got one lash, I'd be like, just done, okay? So obviously, if a man, if his legs gave out, or he was too weak to continue to endure this suffering, his body was still hanging there so that he could endure the rest of his punishment. And so he's showing them like he's being treated like a criminal. He's being treated like a man who's guilty of an extremely heinous crime. And this is all just for preaching the gospel, for saying that because of the resurrection of Christ that we now don't have to work for our salvation. That just is really amazing. Such a simple message. You think that the Jews would embrace that they don't have to live by rules and regulations anymore, but they didn't. One of the sections of Acts that really spoke to me was in Acts chapter 16, and I feel like it really showed the greatest amount of persecution, physical pain that Paul went through throughout the whole book of Acts. And it says, okay, so he's preaching the gospel, he is stripped, he's beaten, he's flogged, he's placed in prison, and then his feet are placed in the stocks. Which is kind of interesting that his feet were placed in stocks while he was already in prison. That kind of shows you, like, that's like maximum security, like for the hardest criminals. And that's what he went through all in this one day. And that really spoke to me because it says at midnight in verse 25 that Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns to God. And that really touched a special place in my heart because I can't imagine bleeding that much or going through that much or enduring so much physical pain and then at the end of all that praying and worshiping God. That's amazing. And I think what would cause someone to do that? Why would somebody endure so much? And it's because Paul had a radical, transforming encounter with God. Paul had an authentic love of God. His life was so deeply transformed that he couldn't keep it to himself. He had to proclaim it to every person that he could, that they might also have a life-changing, radical transformation in their life. Paul had an authentic love of God. And that love was built in his alone time with God. See, his outward suffering displayed his faith that he had inward. His outward suffering displayed his inward faith, his inward relationship with God. He was transformed from the inside out, and that's why we see him suffering so greatly on the outside. And I pray that not only for all of you, but for myself, that we would get along with God more. And that in that time, that we would grow and have a deeper, passionate love for his name. And that out of that alone time with God, that we would then be able to display our faith and demonstrate our faith before men. God has called us to do wonderful ministry, and I believe that God is going to do great and powerful things through each and every one of you and also through this church. But first, we must get along with God. We must not compromise or neglect our alone time with God. And I want to encourage you with that. And I want you to remember the sacrifice that this man made. Remember how this church was built. It was built with blood. Lots of bloodshed. And that's why the letters are in red. But more than that, that's why the letters look so messy. If you look closely at the letters, they look like they're bleeding. And I did that on purpose because I wanted every piece, every element of this piece to represent suffering. I thank God that we can sit here and I can preach and he can preach and we can teach and we can openly share our faith. I thank God for that we don't have to endure suffering like this man did. But I pray that if one day that it comes to that I would be okay to endure and more than that to pray and sing praises to God. And I pray that the same for all of you. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my gift.